the recording, then you may want to mute yourself. But otherwise, there are a number of people who couldn't make it today, so we are recording the rest of our time together for them. So at this point, what I want to do is introduce Chris Marshall, who for most of you probably doesn't need an introduction. When AAA-NZ started many years ago, Chris was pretty much the NZ part of AAA-NZ. At that time, he was teaching at the Bible College of New Zealand in Auckland. After a time, he moved to Victoria University in Wellington, where he went on to lead a restorative justice program there. And what I've asked Chris to do today is just to kind of share a little bit of what he's doing now. He and his wife have both entered a period of retirement, and yet I think he's still involved in doing some work in the restorative justice program there at Victoria University. I'd be interested at least to hear about any new writing projects or anything that Chris is working on. We'll let him talk for a while and then open it up to some questions and answers. I know that there are quite a few people here that have known Chris over years, and probably have welcome.
Thank you. Let's get my notes up here. So it's nice to be with you and to see some familiar faces, some older looking familiar faces as affects us all. I hope you're all doing well in your various forms of lockdown. We have miraculously still managed to avoid that. We had some pretty close calls, but the last time in Wellington we were in lockdown was last March. So our borders are pretty firmly shut, as you probably know, but I know that things are getting pretty serious on your side of the ditch. So I hope you're doing okay individually. So Mark did give me carte blanche to share what I want to do in this time, and I know you've spent some time connecting with each other, so my comments hopefully will be not too long and pretty general. In the RJ team at the university where I've been for the last 7 or 8 years, I make a lot of use of introductory circle processes. You've probably come across this mechanism. We use it in virtually every team meeting we have. It's where somebody poses a kind of opening connection question for the team, and then everybody gets the opportunity to answer this question, handing around a talking piece. We use it a lot in our church as well. It's actually quite a remarkably effective way of involving people in conversations. One time, the person who was facilitating this process asked the opening question of, what have you been thinking about recently? Which is a really open-ended question and very general, but it actually worked really well because it gave people the chance to share quite a diversity of things that they were pondering in the middle of the night or on the bus or whatever, in light of their reading or their podcast. A lot of people these days don't read, they listen to podcasts, or the personal experience. Individual story. One or two things that I've been thinking about recently, pretty not that recent, over the last few months and perhaps over the last year or so, and maybe end with a list of things that I would like to think about more in the future if I ever get the chance to do it. But let me begin, because I know that some of you are friends and it's been a long time since we've been together in the same space. Let me just give you a bit of an update of what's been going on in my life, and for those who don't know me, just a little bit of a personal introduction. So after I finished my PhD in 1985 in London, and it was during that time that our kind of Anabaptist convictions really took root, I returned to New Zealand, or we returned to New Zealand, to teach at a theological college in Auckland, which is now called Laidlaw College. It used to be called the Bible College of New Zealand. After almost 20 years teaching there, I returned to Wellington, where I was born, in 2005 to take up a position in Christian theology in the religious studies program in the university down here, where I taught for 10 years in a religious studies, not a theological setting, which is quite a different kind of environment. I was then appointed to a new professorial chair in restorative justice in a different faculty in this university, which I held for 7 years. And as Mark mentioned, I sort of formally retired last November, although I have remained on a part-time contract since then, partly because my successor, who's from Sydney, was unable to get into the country because of COVID. She eventually was able to slip in when the travel bubble was underway, but that didn't last very long. But she got her family of 4 children and a husband and herself into the country during that sort of window of opportunity. She arrived, I think it was in April that she eventually got here. I was appointed as an emeritus professor, and I continue on a kind of 0.3 contract, just a day and a half a week, partly supporting her, partly continuing a few projects with the chair. I don't know how long that's going to last. I guess it could last as long as I want it to, but I'm pretty sort of open-ended about how long I'm actually going to be on the payroll. My work in the restorative justice chair was very much focused on sort of public policy and public sector engagement, which is kind of new to me. I didn't have any real background in that. It was very interesting, has been very demanding, but very interesting. But it meant I had to sort of suspend my theological work to focus on a new job. It was almost like a career change in some ways. So I was no longer sort of doing New Testament studies, and I was doing more stuff related to the public engagement and public policy work. It's amazing how quickly you feel out of date when you do that. When you don't have the time to keep up with the reading, and certainly when you don't teach a subject, you pretty soon feel that you've really lost touch of what's going on. And I certainly, having taught New Testament studies for over 30 years, I certainly did feel that, and to some extent still do feel that. It's also amazing how quickly the wider Christian community loses interest in you when you're not doing obviously spiritual things. I sort of experienced quite a marked drop-off in preaching and conference invitations, which is kind of interesting in a way, because I certainly considered my work in restorative justice as being at the kind of cutting edge of the mission of God's kingdom. I didn't see myself as sort of becoming entirely secularized by it, but I think many people in the church sort of kind of lost interest at that point. And because of that, I really can't share with you much of my sense of what's happening in the wider church scene in New Zealand, because I don't have any idea. I've got a few hunches, and I've got friends that I talk to about what's going on, but I don't have a lot of first-hand experience. I haven't over the last 7, 8 years or so. Very little opportunity really to engage with churches, apart from the involvement in our own small Christian community here in Wellington, which has been very very satisfying, but it's a very small and kind of marginal kind of community. So I don't really have much of a sense really of what's happening in the wider church here. Another complication that contributes to that kind of lack of exposure, I guess, to the church is I suffered a significant stroke 4 years ago, which came out of the blue. It happened at almost the worst time imaginable. I was on a plane coming back from the US, and the first sort of symptoms occurred. And so had the full stroke once I landed in Wellington at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I was taken directly to the hospital by Margaret. But the main impact of the stroke, and in many ways I've got off quite lightly, but the main impact has been on my speech and on my voice. And it's made public speaking, which I guess I've always seen as my primary gift, much, much harder than it was before. It now requires a lot more preparation and a great deal more effort to do what used to be, pretty easy for me to do. And I continue, although it might not sound very different to you, but over the 4 years, it's been quite a journey of trying to come to terms with with the impact that this event has had on my speech. After I had the stroke, I was off work for 3 months. And during that time, I began the practice of reading the New Testament aloud to myself in English. People often say, "Do you mean in Greek?" No, in English. But I read really large chunks of it out loud, like 5 or 6 chapters in one sitting. It was partly to help to sort of regain my speaking, kind of form of rehabilitation. Therapists didn't suggest that, but I thought it would be quite an interesting way to practice my speech. Also, as kind of source of comfort and reassurance to myself, because it was, it was quite a difficult period. For example, there's places in the New Testament, for example, where Jesus healed those with speech impediments or with struggles, Paul's own struggles with his speech. He refers to on a couple of occasions. It had other benefits too. This thing, I guess, I continue to do it for quite a long time. I haven't done it for quite a long time as well, but I did continue doing this for quite a long time because I found it such an interesting thing to do, to actually listen to the story, for example, of the kind of larger narrative development of the overall New Testament story. So we often break it down into small parts of the story, but when you're reading it for sort of almost from beginning right through to the end of the New Testament, you get a feel for what's going on behind the scenes historically. I remember being struck by the sort of undercurrent of mounting violence that was directed against the Jesus movement and the early church. It's actually quite amazing just how much the narrators tell you of things that were going on amongst the opposition parties, if you like, that really were quite violent, really intending to squash and to kill off this movement. I also stumbled across a lot of odd verses that I've never noticed before, such as 2 verses where Moses is described as being a beautiful baby, one in Acts and one in Hebrews. I think the one in Acts talks about how God found Moses to be a beautiful baby, which is a kind of interesting. I never noticed that before. During this period as well, speaking of Moses, I remembered a paper I had written as a theological student 40 years ago on the call of Moses in Exodus 4 and 5. We always focused on speech issues because that was the thing that I was really myself focused on. I don't know if you remember the story, the burning bush story. It runs through about 2 long chapters when God calls Moses to go and go back to Egypt and confront Pharaoh and lead the people of Israel out of captivity. And in the story, which is regarded as one of the really superlative narratives in the Old Testament, Moses raises a whole string of objections to why he couldn't possibly do this task that God was calling him to. I can't remember now, it was about 6 or 7 things that he keeps coming back at God and saying, I can't do it because of this. The penultimate objection he raises is in Exodus 4. He says, oh my Lord, I have never been, nor even now that you have spoken to me. Even this experience in the burning bush is not going to fix the problem. I am slow of speech and I'm slow of tongue. I think the Hebrew text there is literally heavy of tongue. And that's exactly how I felt after the stroke when I was trying to recover my speech. It was like having this great big weight in my mouth. But God replies to Moses, he says, who gives speech to mortals? Who makes them deaf or mute, seeing or blind? Is not I, the Lord? Now go, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you are to speak. In the Septuagint, it says, I will bring together the words that you are going to say. And that little verse, I've actually got it printed on my office wall here, remains quite a source of encouragement for me when I struggle with my continuing issues around fluency and ease of eloquence, this promise, I will be with you with your mouth and with your speech. Anyway, in that 3-month period, I realized, I guess I knew this, but I realized again that as much as I love restorative justice, and as much as I enjoy its philosophical and practical challenges, I realized that I love reading the New Testament even more. And for me, it was like coming back to my first language, my first home. And now that I've moved into sort of semi-retirement, I am looking forward to having more time to re-engage with the Christian community if they're interested in having me now, and being able to use my first language rather than having to do what you often have to do when you're working in a secular public square of sort of using a kind of more neutral language to get your points across. And bringing again to that task of New Testament interpretation, stuff that I have learned over the last 7 or 8 years from working in the public arena. None of this is to say that I've been completely missing in action theologically during this last phase of my career. The last major piece of writing that I did was a contribution to a collection of essays for a book on criminology and public theology, which was published in the UK. I think it came out just at the beginning of this year, about 6 months ago. And it's quite an impressive collection, actually, of essays by quite a range of criminologists in particular, but also a few theologians kicking around the traps as well. And I contributed an essay entitled Sin, Shame and the Atonement, or Sin, Shame and Atonement, a challenge for secular redemption. And I thought I'd just share a few learnings that I gained from that piece of work, because in a sense, I think it does speak directly or maybe indirectly to some of the concerns of Anabaptist peace theology. Let me just begin with a little bit of background on why I ended up working on this particular theme. In 2001, my book, Beyond Retribution, A New Testament Vision for Justice, Crime and Punishment, was published. So it's new. This 20 dedicated study that had been published on the theological or biblical foundations for the theory and practice of restorative justice. There was things that had been chapters or articles that had been written here and there, but I think this is the first attempt to do a full book-length piece of work on the kind of biblical foundations for this remarkable new movement. The basic argument of Beyond Retribution is that the first Christians experienced in Christ and lived out in their faith communities an understanding of justice that heals, restores, and reconciles rather than hurts, punishes, and kills. And that this understanding of justice, this more healing, restorative understanding of justice, ought to drive a Christian contribution to criminal justice debate and practice today. So that, if you like, is the kind of argument of Beyond Retribution. Two of the biggest obstacles I faced in trying to mount this proposal, that when you turn to what justice means in the New Testament, you encounter the restorative way of thinking. Two of the biggest obstacles that I faced in mounting this argument, and I still face in trying to propose this to Christian audiences. One is the sort of dominant understanding of the atonement, the death and resurrection of Christ, the saving effect of Christ's death and resurrection. The dominant understanding of the atonement as an act of penal substitution. The argument that God's justice requires retributive punishment for sin. But in his mercy, God has found a way to divert this needed penalty, needed by his justice, divert it onto Christ as our substitute, and is then free, if you like, to forgive us because his justice has been satisfied through the punishment of our sin in Christ. It's a very common, probably still the predominant a very liberal understanding of the atonement that reigns in many churches, certainly in the sort of evangelical part of the church. The other obstacle was notions of final judgment that involve everlasting torment and hell for the wicked or for unbelievers. Again, based on the idea that God's retributive justice requires punishment in order to be vindicated, that something has to be done to punish sinners. And if they haven't taken the opportunity that's been offered to them, then their fate is to be consigned to the fires of hell. So with respect to the atonement, I thought I did a pretty good job, I would, in arguing that, yes, the New Testament does use a lot of justice language in describing justice and justification language. So the justice, if you like, the justice metaphor is a big one that is used to understand the death of Christ. But in doing so, the New Testament, or Paul in particular, employs a biblical notion of covenantal or redemptive or restorative justice rather than a Greco-Roman notion of retributive justice. That when Paul speaks of God's justice being revealed and satisfied in the work of Christ, he's not thinking of that happening through substitutionary punishment or violent punishment, but it's vindicated in the defeat of sin and the restoration of humanity to a relationship with God. That's what justifies or vindicates God's justice. And I remain convinced that a restorative way of thinking about divine justice makes a lot more sense of the New Testament teaching about the death and resurrection of Christ than does the traditional punitive way of thinking about it. I also reckon I did a reasonable job in understanding final judgment, or trying at least, in a sense it's harder, but trying to understand final judgment in restorative terms as well. Although in the last few months, I've been found myself reading a lot more and thinking a lot more about the idea of universal salvation, of actually being a kind of logical corollary of the fact that God's restorative action in Christ and his enemy-loving character is made to be satisfied in the universal salvation of all that God has made. But that's another for another time, perhaps. But there's been some quite interesting stuff being written around that recently. Anyway, getting back to this notion of shame, just after Beyond Retribution came out, I remember giving a lecture on justice and the atonement at Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia, which many of you will know quite well. And in the Q&A session after my talk, someone, his name is Norman Krauss, which again, his name may be familiar to many of you. I think I'm right in saying he was a former missionary theologian in Japan. And I remember him standing up and asking me the question, have reflected on the role of shame in the atonement. So I was talking about the role of justice in the atonement and trying to say that this justice metaphor is best understood by using a restorative understanding of justice. And he asked, well, what about shame? Have you ever thought about that? And I remember responding to the question by saying, no, I haven't, not really, but I'm aware of the issue, partly because I read his book, Norman's book, and he has a few pages on this in his book, but also because the other things going on around shame that I was aware of, but I hadn't thought about it much in regard to the death and resurrection of Christ. So I kind of was saying, well, I know this is important and I need to get around to think about it next. I was aware of the issue of shame being of some interest, partly because notions of honor and shame were beginning to be used in what are often called social world studies of the New Testament. So when scholars sort of trained in anthropology in particular started sort of writing and researching on the gospel stories in particular, but the New Testament in general, they started bringing these categories of honor and shame, which were kind of universal in the ancient Mediterranean world, to bear on their interpretation. And, I was aware of that. I was also aware that missionary anthropologists, I guess like Norman himself, were reporting that in so-called shame-based or collectivist cultures, that more forensic or legalistic and individualistic understandings of the atonement from Western theology didn't seem to make much cultural sense. They didn't tend to be in that kind of mental space, and were much more interested around issues of faith and honor and shame and so on. So I was aware that these categories were being applied to biblical studies, but there wasn't really still very much being done, as far as I was aware, particularly on how Christ's saving work through his death and resurrection addressed the problem of shame in human experience. And there was no, I think it's fair to say there is still no fully fledged atonement theory that has been developed around the theme of shame and honor, at least, or particularly of shame. So, yeah, I was aware of this category, but it took me the best part of 20 years to eventually try to think more about it. And I used the invitation to contribute to this book as the opportunity to do so. So you ask you to contribute to a book, and then they want to know what you're going to write on. So I thought, well, you know, I'm going to have a go at this. And so I told them I was going to think about the role of shame. And quite honestly, many times after that, I regretted that decision, because the task really did nearly kill me. Because starting from scratch, which I was pretty well starting from scratch, I soon discovered that the literature on the phenomenon and on the psychology of shame is vast. There's a vast amount being written about it. It's complex. It's quite controversial because people are often talking about different things. Shame has many, many different faces, many different roles that it plays in human culture and human experience. And I quite often thought, I'm drowning this stuff. How do I really get some degree of mastery of this area? At the same time, the theological literature on the subject was still pretty sparse. So the first thing that I tend to do when I start working on a new theme is go to the standard reference books. Go to the Bible dictionaries and the encyclopedias, and I've got quite a few of them on my bookshelf. And you look up shame, and there's hardly anything there. And the older stuff, in fact, in some of the older stuff, there was nothing there. I mean, apart from a kind of sort of lexicon entry. And the more recent stuff that was being written focused almost exclusively on the sociology of shame, on the role that shame plays in society, rather than what sort of existential role it plays in salvation, what kind of role it played in the saving work of Christ. So I found that a major intellectual challenge, stroke or not, a major intellectual challenge to learn enough about shame from the secular literature to speak meaningfully about it. I by no means think I mastered it at all. I didn't, but to have enough about it to be able to sort of make sense of it, and then to sort of pick up some of the relevant clues in the New Testament about shame, not just the use of the word, but some of the narrative details around it, because ideas are much bigger than just words. So you're looking at how the idea is present in the text. Details that we often miss or minimize, either because we're not looking for anything about shame when we're reading these words or these ideas, or because more commonly, I think, we confuse shame with guilt. We treat shame as just another way of talking about guilt, as though these are two different words, but for the same kind of experience. But the clues are there. There are interesting clues in the New Testament. Think, for example, of Hebrews 12, where the writer invites his readers to look to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising its shame, and has taken a seat at the right hand of the throne of God. So there are interesting telltale clues there. So in my essay, I basically asked the question, how does Christ's redemptive work address the problem of entrenched shame in the human condition and its often debilitating impact on individuals? What difference does the work of Christ make to this problem of shame? I also asked, because it was a book about criminology, how does the criminal justice system deal with the problem of shame and its massive contribution to criminal behavior, and in particular to crimes of violence? So, decades of research has shown that those who commit the most horrific crimes of violence often do so in the deadly grip of pathological shame or self-hatred. Frequently, you can almost say invariably, stemming from the experience of overwhelming abuse or neglect in childhood, where their sense of personal value and dignity has been completely almost destroyed by their experience. And what the psychological research shows quite clearly is that offenders who are driven by deeply ingrained shame in their life often lack a sense of empathy for their victims. And they often also lack feelings of guilt or remorse for their actions, because they are so totally consumed with their own internal anguish that they have almost no emotional energy left over to try and enter into the anguish that other people are experiencing. As well as that, imposing harsh punishment on such people in the name of correcting them, corrections must be the most fantastically misnamed institution in the public sector. Far from correcting such people, punishment actually makes the problem worse. It does nothing to address the sort of the toxic root of their behavior, and it often exacerbates the problem, because imposing punitive shame, and I mean, corrections, the prison system is all about the imposition of shame, imposing punitive shame on those who are already consumed by shame usually triggers not a sense of remorse or a desire to be any different, but it triggers anger, denial, aggression, and a deluge of other defiant responses. And what I suggest in the essay, and I begin by looking at some research that an American forensic psychiatrist did around this, but what I suggest is that is the failure of the criminal justice system to recognize or to attempt to repair the ruinous impact of pathological shame. That's that deep, toxic self-hatred. The ruinous impact of pathological shame and those who are caught up in serious crime, that I suggest is the Achilles heel of much of criminal justice policy and practice. Rather than mitigating shame, our current system makes the problem worse. But it's also, I think, the Achilles heel of a good deal of theological reflection on sin, repentance, and atonement. And as you probably know, theological reflection on these things has done a lot to shape the way the criminal justice system works in the West. So both criminological and theological reflection have been largely dominated by the language of guilt and punishment. Both have largely failed to factor in the role of shame in understanding and responding to human transgression. And both often display an impoverished understanding of what's involved in overcoming the legacy of shame in people's experience. We just think that sort of punishing behavior is enough. And then I go on to argue that that you put on the right kind of glasses, you can start to see that the unique saving power that is ascribed to the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, which we sort of use the theological shorthand of the atonement to describe, that includes its capacity to expose, to absorb, and to disrupt the tyranny of shame and to offer a pathway to healing for those who are tangled in its poisonous web. Now, I'm going to finish very soon, but there's no time to trace how I go about trying to show this, but it does depend on a number of fundamental points or fundamental insights that became really clear to me when I started working on this idea. One is, again, teasing out the connection between shame and guilt. They're not the same thing, although they're often very closely related with each other. And I think this is the case that guilt, the problem of guilt, which is really about our conduct, about our behavior, that dealing with the problem of guilt is much easier, and I guess much easier for God, for that matter, than is dealing with the problem of shame. Because we have a mechanism for dealing with guilt. It's called, repentance, pardon, and forgiveness. But the legacy of shame strikes at the very core of one's sense of worth and one's sense of dignity, and that's very much hard to access. So I think trying to disentangle these two realities of shame and guilt was for me kind of enlightening and helpful. Another kind of fundamental insight was recognizing, and I knew this, but again, just trying to bring this to bear on this problem, that the Bible's concept of sin is much more complex or much more comprehensive than the kind of concept of sin that we often have. Sin in the Bible is much more than committing a few forbidden actions which incur moral guilt. The real problem which atonement needs to address, whether it's in the Old Testament with the sacrificial system or through the death of Christ in the New Testament, the real problem that atonement needs to address is the way that sin combines guilt with shame, with servitude. There's a kind of three-legged stool. Guilt can be pardoned, but shame needs to be exposed. And one of the things about shame is that it always hides from sight. In the Garden of Eden, that's when Adam and Eve ate the apple, they went and hid because they were ashamed. There's something about shame that tries to hide itself. Shame needs to be exposed, it needs to be cleansed, and it needs to be disempowered. And I think it needs more than just forgiveness, the act of sort of legal forgiveness for that to happen. A third thing that was very important for this piece of work was to recognize how Jesus in his ministry identified with the greatest objects of shame in his own society, those on the margins, who were counted as worthless according to the standards of his culture in his day, and how his actions and how his teaching completely reversed standards of honor and shame that prevailed, the standards that underwrote the worthlessness of these people, and he conferred great dignity and value on them by the way that he identified with them. But his supreme confrontation with the diabolical power of shame came on the cross. So when Hebrews speaks of Christ enduring the cross and despising its shame, I think he's not just meaning, he's not reflecting on the contemporary evaluation of crucifixion as being irredeemably shameful, which it certainly was. Crucifixion was all about doing the most shameful thing imaginable to a human person. But as well as that, I think he is alluding to the way in which, through going through that shameful experience, Christ overcame the deadly grip of shame on the human condition itself. And I think that happened by this mysterious way in which he fused his own sinless humanity with the sinful condition of the human race, and kind of soaked up the shame that clings to us as a fallen race, almost like a kind of poultice. He soaked it up and took it to the grave. And he did that on our behalf. And in so doing, he conferred absolute value and worth on every human life. So the sense of shame, or at least of pathological shame, this kind of toxic shame, which is its most serious and debilitating form, entails a sense of being sort of flawed or polluted or worthless at the very core of one's being. And it comes with a sense of fear that when other people realize just how worthless we are, they will no longer accept us and they will no longer regard us as deserving of love. So it's that sense of being completely worthless in every sense, and the fear that eventually people will recognize that and will be rejected. The cross, I think, proves that that diagnosis is false. It proves that every individual, every human bearer of the divine image, irrespective of their actions or achievements or any debasement they have suffered at the hands of others, because shame is often done to us as well as something that we do to ourselves. But regardless of that every individual has indestructible worth and deserves to be loved at all costs. Because ultimately, what I realized is ultimately the answer to shame, both theologically and pastorally, the answer to shame is the experience of grace. Therapists and shame theorists often identify empathy as the quality that most counteracts the sense of toxic shame in people, that helps to overcome the self-loathing that they feel at the very heart of their being. To show empathy for somebody is to affirm their significance, that they're worth feeling empathy towards, and it's to reassure people that however dark and despairing their struggles are, they're not alone in those struggles. That those human struggles are part of the shared anguish of the human race. One writer describes empathy as, quote, an adjudication of a person's inherent value. That when you show empathy for somebody, you're already in that very act affirming that that person is a person of value. And that is what grace is. Grace is a display of divine empathy for human destitution that adjudicates on our absolute value and proves our intrinsic lovability. And I came to realize that the way we speak of grace often misses the point, if not actually makes the very opposite of the point that it's about. So we often use grace almost to reinforce a person's sense of worthlessness. You know, you're so worthless, but God manages to show you grace anyway. We speak of grace as being unmerited favor. It's a kind of a thumbnail sketch we use for what we mean by the word grace, and it's a helpful way to think about it. But I realized it's unmerited, not in the sense of being entirely unwarranted, but in the sense of being warranted solely on the basis of one's unique creaturehood, irrespective of any other merits or demerits that we possess. So paradoxically, what I realize, and maybe this is the one take-home message, paradoxically, grace proves our worthwhileness rather than our worthlessness. And as such, it actually subverts the power of shame. That Christ loved humanity enough to endure and exhaust its shame in order to bring us into union with God confers absolute value on every human life. And someone can personally recognize that they are unconditionally loved and accepted and honored by the source of all goodness and beauty in the universe. If that truth can strike home, then they have the deepest remedy for shame imaginable. So that's what I've been thinking about recently. I found it a very stretching, but also a very powerful and ennobling kind of thing to attend to. And if you're interested, then I can send you the details of the essay. It's certainly not the last thing or even the best thing to be said about it, but I certainly found it a very helpful piece of work to do. So lots of other things I would like to be able to spend more time to think about in the future. I would like to think about more about identity politics. Something about the way in which identity politics is working today that is kind of trying to address the sense of worthlessness that people feel, and they're trying to find it by championing, a minority identity or whatever it is. But that's just an ambition, and I don't really have anything more to say about that at this stage. But I'll stop. So I don't know how long I've taken. It's probably longer than it should have been.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm glad that you do have your voice back. I'll give you a few minutes here to rest your voice. I'm going to make an executive decision here, and usually I try and wrap us up by 5 o'clock, but I'm going to extend it for another 15 minutes because I'm sure that people have questions that they would like to put to Chris. I know I do, but I will resist the urge to do that now. So if that's all right with people, if people need to leave at the top of the hour, that's fine. But we'll let this run to give people a chance to ask Chris some questions. So thank you very much, and I will be in touch with you to get some details on that article. If we can publish something in the mailing, I would love to be able to do that. And also, I think we're going to have you back next year for another one of these and hear more about what you're thinking. So I will shut up and let somebody else ask a question or a comment. So Bruce, go ahead.
Hi, Chris. You don't know me. I'm in Hamilton. I probably know some of the same people as you.
Oh, hi, Bruce.
I'm intrigued by this because I haven't been thinking about the shame side of this, but I have thought about the other side of the coin in terms of honor, and read something recently. I think it might have been Left Behind and Loving It website. Well, talked about the Sermon on the Mount as being, and the word blessed as being more likely to be something like honored are whoever.
Yeah.
I wonder then if the shame side of that is the woes that come in either Matthew or Luke. I can't remember which. I don't know. It's just an idea. Any comment?
Yeah. That translation is. I'm just trying to remember the name of the guy who wrote a book on honor and shame in Matthew, and I was struck as well by his suggestion that blessed could be translated as greatly honored are those. And in the article, I do talk about the way, largely drawing on his work, the way in which the Sermon on the Mount kind of subverts standards of honor, which is largely based, as I understand it, on achievement and on sort of social role and wealth and in the ancient world really was controlled by these kinds. It was almost like a cross-cultural coding system that everybody recognized. You recognize who were the people that you needed to defer to because of their honor, and it was a very very competitive system. And so the scholars who've written on honor and shame talk about these. I think the phrase is these agonistic debates where the public debates that Jesus engages in with the Pharisees, for example, that there's a kind of competition for who's going to win them, and the person who managed to sort of, which Jesus usually did, he managed to sort of come out as winner of the debate. Then they grew in stature, and so this guy goes through the Sermon on the Mount and shows how Jesus sort of forbids his disciples to engage in that kind of competition for honor. So go and pray in secret where your heavenly Father sees you in secret, rather than doing it where everybody can sort of think that you're a pretty spiritual dude. So so shame and honor, I think, are two sides of the same coin. But I think and I haven't thought this through in as much detail as I need to, but I think a lot of the stuff being written on shame and honor is about the kind of the social hierarchy aspects of it. And the question I was trying to get at was the use of honor and shame as a way of organizing social relationships depends on the impact of shame psychologically on people. So to be struggling with shame that's imposed from the outside, it only works as a way of controlling society if people feel it inside themselves and they feel shamed, and same applies for honor. And I was kind of more interested, I guess, in the psychology of shame than in its kind of sociology, although I think they're closely related.
Thank you.
Bill, go ahead.
Just to say, thank you very much, Chris. After decades of prison ministry, I absolutely resonate with what you're saying, because lying beneath the crime in most cases is this shame and self-condemnation. And unless you get down to that root, you won't be able to help the other person find the resilience to track a new course.
Yeah.
Regardless of all the other things. So I completely agree with what you're saying. My question is, here in Australia, we have a terribly low age of criminality, and the incarceration of juveniles in this country is just appalling. How can the work that you're doing and others address that and address it to the places within the criminal justice system so that that can be changed?
Yeah. I was asked a question like that when I gave a lecture in Auckland a few months ago on this work. And my answer was that it can only be changed at a policy level. We've got a very progressive government here. Jacinda Ardern, and they announced in their first term they're going to completely overhaul the criminal justice system. And they went round and there's 3 reports written, feeding back what the wider community thought, and it was looking really promising, and nothing's happened since then. It seems to have stalled. So it's a very difficult thing. We've made a problem for ourselves that's very hard to fix. And we have a terrible rate of incarceration in this country. I mean, it's higher than yours. And we've made this rod for our own backs, and it's actually very, very difficult to change. And so while I think restorative justice has a contribution to make, it's, by itself, it's not going to change the problem unless there is a political change. And I was quite hopeful here. The tone of the public sort of discussions was really looking quite positive. That the wider community was saying we recognise that what we're doing is causing more damage than is good, and there seemed to be almost a political convergence around this. Why it stalled, I don't know, and it's kind of depressing that it has. So I think it needs to be a top-down move at that point, but that top-down move is only going to happen if there's a grassroots kind of alternative being developed and a grassroots demand for it. And I think around that grassroots stuff, then the sort of restorative work has a contribution to make. What I'd hoped here when the government was saying, they were saying we're going to make a once-in-a-generation complete overhaul. We're going to almost start again. That's probably part of the problem. They promised really big. And they said, they said, what we think restorative justice is part of this, although they preferred the term transformative justice. I hoped that what they would have done would have come with a kind of almost a advertising slogan to use, because some of the stuff that's happened over the last 30 years has been carried forward by slogans like tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. That kind of political sloganeering. enable the kind of the punitive stuff to take off. And I thought we need an alternative that's more restorative. And I personally thought that the idea of selling the idea of a justice that repairs, well, when I say we want a justice system that repairs, I thought right and left agreeing that right and say, well, that makes sense. The justice system ought to try and repair the damage to victims. And the left would say, well, we need a system that repairs damage to victims and offenders. But they haven't done that. They've just talked about wanting to change the system. But until I think we embrace a different concept of what we're trying to do in the justice system, then I can't see the kind of devastation that's being caused being significantly changed. I mean, they've made quite an effort here to try and bring the imprisonment rate down, but they've done it through sort of administrative things like finding out people who should have been released 3 years ago, but they got lost in the system and things like that. I think what they should have done, and there seems to be a demand for it, is say, no, you actually want to think about the whole system in a different way.
And just to encourage you, you need to do that work on identity politics because the root of it is exactly the same.
Well, I've got a hunch that it is, yeah. Yeah.
Until you get the media reporting in other than a binary fashion, you'll make little progress. The media wants you either tough on crime or soft on crime. You either have identity politics or you're mushy. And the media reporting then drives the political behavior, because if you don't get coverage, you're not in politics. It's very simple. So the media is actually driving a vast amount of this. If you can educate some journalists to actually report the news and these issues in a way which actually until that happens, you won't get progress.
Yeah. And the problem now, of course, is that there's no one media that everybody is affected by, isn't it? There's sectional media. So the media I listen to were all saying the right stuff, but the other media weren't. But yeah.
Somebody else. Okay, Matt Clark.
Hey, Chris, thanks for all of those reflections. Bill and I have been thinking a lot the last year about mercy. And as you were talking about shame, we were thinking that mercy fits nicely as one of God's key mechanisms for addressing or for getting people past their shame and reconciling all things in Christ. I wonder if you've got some reflections on the distinction between grace and mercy. Is there something different between those two, or are they sort of synonymous in this context?
I was thinking about mercy myself, actually, and something I've been reading quite a bit around universalism, which has been quite interesting. But I know from stuff that I've written that this idea that justice and mercy sort of stand in tension with each other is not true of the Bible. So, there's God exalts himself to show mercy and thereby demonstrates justice. I mean, the two are two sides of the same coin. And it's just something I was just reading the other day. The person was saying, and I hadn't sort of thought about it quite this clearly, but he was saying the idea of mercy as somehow spending justice, that we think of justice as you deserve to be punished, but I will suspend that and I'll therefore show you mercy. And he said that's a mistake. That's not the way that mercy and justice work. So mercy is more about the sense of concern for a person's welfare and a person's misery and a person's suffering. Is more compassionate stuff. And so I guess that's a sense of showing that a person is worth it. I mean, mercy is, I guess, rooted in the same sense. You show mercy because the person is worth showing human fellow feelings to. I guess that's similar to what I'm saying about grace. No, you could probably distinguish them if you thought hard and long about it, but I think there probably are similar kinds of experiences.
Alistair.
My turn.
Yeah.
Hi, Chris. I haven't actually met you.
Hi.
But that was really was great to listen to that. I often go quite down a practical route. You guys are probably quite good theologians, and I'm just a mum and a business owner who sells coffee to people every day. And I guess I experience, not necessarily at the extreme end of people that are actually in prison and are criminals, but people who are broken and who hurt each other and have been hurt. Just in the conversations I hear, even in the back street here. But one of the things I was thinking about is that shame that you're talking about. I mean, I've got my own personal reflections of my childhood. I've got reflections of my own mothering of my kids. And this on this grander scale of criminology at that end is often there is this brokenness and shame at the root. And I think that, yeah, I don't know where to go with this, other than I think there's some really important things we have to look about in childhood. How do we raise our kids?
Yeah.
And I think about, you know, the whole thing of, you know, time out for kids, and then now we're talking about time in with kids. It's when kids are so being playing out or being really naughty, thinking that we separate them out there so they get their act together, actually terrible things about themselves. And it is that ingrained belief of who you are that carries right through your childhood. You know, I can go back to my own story and think about things that I said about myself that still get triggered now, and I have to, as an adult, say that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, or it's not true anymore. But how those lies in childhood shape the rest of your life. You know, and they say give me a child until they're 7. You know, that's great if it's good. That definitely needs to be done at this thinking level, but at a really practical level. How do we help this next generation coming through being raised? Because to me, that's where the hope is. You know, you have to be born again. These people have to be born in their hearts of who they are and how loved they are. So that would be my reaction. Excellent. How practical can it be now with the way we raise our kids?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think having grandchildren now, they're just very, very young, very much part of our life. And you think of your own parenting and grandparenting, and you realize how vulnerable a child is to all kinds of self-condemnation sort of ways. Because I don't think it's something we can completely avoid. I think this is why it is part of the fallen human condition, because there is a good side to shame. I mean, shame plays a positive role as well as a negative role. So, I mean, in the talk I gave it, you know, talk about Donald Trump, they often describe him as a shameless person. He was unable to feel shame about the things that he ought to feel ashamed of. So shame is a sense of comparing yourself against some standard of evaluation and falling short. And so there's a necessary good side about shame. You know, people need to feel ashamed of certain things, and if they don't, then they're just as dangerous as those who are completely consumed by it. But pathological shame is when that sort of self-hatred becomes a kind of condition of being. That's you know, how you are all the time. You condemn and hate and loathe yourself. And I think a lot of that does go back to childhood and to abuse and neglect. I remember many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, going to a workshop on family violence, I think it was, and the person was talking about neglect in childhood. I remember her saying that, you know, for a child who is physically or psychologically or sexually abused, it's awful, it's terrible. But she felt there's something almost even worse than that, and that was people who are completely neglected.
Mm.
And she said, as a teacher, you can see it in their eyes that they've never had the experience of being affirmed or being valued at all. That they are so worthless that they're not even worth abusing, you know, in that sense. And that is, you know, it just breaks my heart to think of children having that done to them. Yeah, I think if you talk about our criminal justice system, we use just a fraction of that money to address the needs of vulnerable children in the first 3 years. Or even most loving parent, I think, has the same struggle. How do you help a child acquire a sense of self-esteem? I just heard on the radio the other day an interview with a woman who's written a book, American woman wrote a book, How Do You Raise Children So They Don't End Up as Assholes? And it was driven by a reaction to the kind of, you know, the Trump era, and wondering, well, how do you stop children becoming? There's a problem of I think they call it inflated praise of children. They kind of attempt to, you know, she used the example of a child draws a stick figure and the parent says, that's the best person, the best work of art I've ever seen. She said that also subtly undermines this child's self-esteem, I guess because they know it's not true, and therefore they become unsure about their own value, even though you're trying to sort of build them up. So I think parenting is a really hard job, obviously, and but you're right. I mean, I think it's I think most of the major severe social problems we have begin in the family home and be around those first 2 or 3 years of existence.
That's a great segue for announcing our next month. Next month, we're going to do Raising Kids Who Care. Susie Lee is going to be, the author of this book, is going to be joining us, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up some of these kids who are socially aware and care about issues like many of the ones that we've talked about today. Thank you again, Chris, for being with us. And for sure, we'll want to do this again sometime next year. Let me just close with a prayer of thanksgiving for Chris, and that his voice and many other things were restored after his stroke, and that he was able to be with us today. Thank you, God, for all of these people who are gathered here. You know their needs and the condition they're in, whether they're in lockdown or whatever it is. I pray a blessing on each of us who are here today. And thank you for this opportunity to Zoom together and be together in this space. So be with us all as we leave this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for letting us extend it. And we look forward to being